Yeah, you have the power of the button.
Okay, so we're talking today about businesses returning to work and being able to see things moving forward and beginning to think about what they might look like in the future and how things might evolve a little bit. And you were just going to say, Frances, something about that before you munched a carrot.
Carrots are really important when you're on calls like this. So it turns out that our government, in its wisdom, is thinking carefully about a phased return to work. And I think we're focusing just on work. And there are some people this week who will be sitting at home who have high levels of anxiety about this whole pandemic, who are going to say to themselves, oh my God, I don't want to get back onto public transport. I might catch a disease and die, or I might catch a disease and give it to other people who might die. And so they will be really anxious about their increased potential exposure to a disease for which they have a great deal of fear. At the other end of the spectrum, there'll be people going, brilliant, I can't wait to get back to work. I don't really care if I get a virus anyway, because I'm fit and strong and healthy and I'll be fine and I'm not going to infect anybody else anyway. And there'll be lots of in between. So there'll be some people who will be going, oh, I've quite enjoyed working from home. It's been really nice. I've been able to, one of the clients I'm speaking to, she said, I go for a walk at 6 o'clock every morning, often for an hour and a half. There's no way that I'll be able to do that when I have to go back to the office. And I feel like I'll really miss that time out there when I would have just been sitting in a car and on a train and walking across London. And so she's sort of, really think I need to work from home more often because I've been really productive and had that time.
But I think managers will start taking that on board, because I think, the reality, like you said, lots of people don't want to get on public transport. The message has been so strong and so clear that we have to stay isolated, we have to stay at home, that I think a survey that was done in last month suggests that only 21% of people want to get back on public transport to go to work. So that's going to have huge implications for people, where managers are expecting people to go back into the workplace and their workforce are turning around saying, actually, I don't want to do that, I don't feel safe. And then where do the managers sit in that? Because there's obviously the legal aspect, which I can't advise on the legal side of it, but in terms of ethically and morally, if someone doesn't feel fundamentally safe, actually, it's about respecting individual differences, isn't it? And then also that whole sense of some people, their perspectives of how they're going to be viewed if they make the choice to go back in or not to go back in, and what their colleagues think of them, what their managers think of them, what opportunities they're going to miss out on if they're not physically present in the office.
And that brings us round to a question for organisations that actually I think has been present for certainly the last 5 or 6 years. I've been talking to lots of organisations about this, which is, what's the conversation we should be having about performance? Because we are pretty obsessed with measuring or evaluating or judging, depending on what word you want to use, kind of all the time. So in a world where some of my colleagues are now working from home, well, that's fine for them because it's really easy for them, and so that's easy for them and they're having a bit of an easy ride, and I'm actually having to come into the office and working really hard. So how come they're going to get, how are you going to compare their performance with mine when I'm struggling into the office and putting aside my own needs in terms of this situation? And for leaders, I think there's an interesting conversation to be had about what actually is the contribution that needs to be made. Because it clearly isn't numbers of hours.
Yes,
and it clearly is the number of meetings you're in.
Yeah, it reminds me actually of on the news earlier this week, I think it was the First Minister for Wales, or someone was talking about targets, and really interestingly, the use of targets. And he was saying something like, it's about, I think he was talking about testing. And it's like, well, actually, do we want the numbers to sound really great? Because actually we have this notion that the bigger the number for testing and so on, the better, the more effective we're being. And actually he was saying, well, no, because it's about what's the point of the test. So is there a clear purpose for testing for COVID or not? Is it just a numbers game? And so many people, I really loved hearing him talk, because it's such a refreshing change from, we've got to have the biggest numbers to say we are successful. Actually, that's not the case. And I think you're right. We've got to look at what's the meaning of when we're looking at people's performance or how we're judging people. What does that look like? What's meaningful, rather than against traditional, tick list objectives.
And how do we know? Because it will differ for each individual in the team, but also for each individual team. So how do we know what actually is making the best contribution? And I think that also, it's not a fixed thing. It is dynamic. Yeah. My contribution to some stages of our project might be immense. And at other phases, actually, my contribution is probably not that helpful because I'm an ideas person, and now I'm actually getting in the way of just some practical things being delivered. Yeah. So how we manage that as a team, I think, needs to be much more of a team conversation. I was really interested to read about Dick Elsey. I don't know if you saw this, but he's the CEO of a manufacturing company that was put in charge of something called Ventilator Challenge UK. So he brought together different manufacturing companies to make loads more ventilators, because we realized we were somewhat being held to ransom by the kind of global shortage of ventilator equipment. And he said, we had such a short period of time. Normally we would go, oh, let's take 2 years to do this. Let's make sure our shareholders get a quarterly update. We had to do this in weeks, if not days. Yeah. So how did we get that productive? And he said, I was listening to him on Radio 4, he used an expression that I thought really resonated with me. He said, we had to cut out the noise. Yes. We had to cut out all of the stuff that organizations create around the core purpose. And of course, it's not always possible to do just what he's done. He had a very specific focus because he had a specific purpose. But what if we as a team constantly, maybe quarterly, reviewed how much of the stuff that we're doing is just noise and how much of it is really core to the purpose that we bring to our organization.
Yeah. And you and I have talked a lot about that noise, because during this whole, coronavirus lockdown, it's like we are being inundated with advice and what we should and shouldn't be thinking about. And actually for managers, it's just a sense of overwhelm, just trying to keep on top of your emails and your inbox, offering this free bit of advice or, this free webinar. And there's just so much of it. And I think it's going back to looking at actually what is important, and as you say, with your team doing it, because there's so many managers have this misconception that they're supposed to be perfect and they're supposed to know all the answers and they're supposed to be leading the way forward really clearly and with a clear vision, and their team are going to follow them. And actually no one really knows what it's going to look like. And that whole sense, when I hear people saying when they're looking forward to things reverting to normal, forget that. We don't want to go backwards in terms of how we were. You just said about your friend who enjoys their walk for an hour and a half in the mornings. Actually, those are your silver linings. How are we working better? How are we managing to function better? What are we contributing that's different to what we were before? What strengths have we discovered we've got, which we didn't realize we had before? And it's all those kinds of things actually make the future look different, but make it fit better for the employees, for the team. And that's what's the important bit to measure, isn't it?
It is. And I think managers and leaders are pressured to create the solution, the process. And by the way, everybody should have the same process. So we tend to create noise because we're trying to create a process that is the solution for all of the problems, rather than working in a more agile way. And I guess organizations that do follow agile principles were probably more familiar with this, but it's better to have a few huddles around a really core purpose that is relevant for you at that moment than it is to have to institutionalize everything that you do. So for managers sitting at home now, maybe watching this and saying to themselves, how am I going to kind of bring my team together? Because I know that we're not going to have space in the office for everyone to be distanced and in the office. So some people are going to have to be at home. Some people are going to have to come in. How do I make those decisions? Oh,
yes.
Why don't I make that a conversation with the team? And why don't we say, do you know what? Whatever we decide, it doesn't have to be forever.
Exactly.
And it doesn't have to be for everyone. And it won't solve everything. But it will be what we agree for now until we decide to review. And it will be the best that we can do that delivers the most productivity for whatever our purpose is.
Yeah. And I think it's almost those next steps, isn't it? It's not, as you said, it's not looking at the long-term plan, because actually when people have that kind of long-term plan, it almost becomes so distant, and it goes out of date so quickly that it becomes a paper exercise, and it's looking at where we are now and where we want to be next week, and what as in our team, what is each person's part in getting us there. And if I'm assigned with this particular responsibility, what support do I need from my colleagues or from my manager? The manager having the vulnerability and authenticity to say, actually, I'm not really sure, but let's try it. And being able to say to their team, what do you need me to do differently? What do you need me to do better? And actually kind of being very much on a level playing field and exploring that future step together and asking people for their insights. Because when you think about performance management, it's often so much about, well, these are our targets in our company, and this is where we think we're at, and this is what we think you should be doing, let's tick you off. Whereas actually the insights that employees can offer and say, you know what, being away from the office, these amazing ideas, or we're doing these things differently, and actually, why were we doing that so much of the week? Why not we just focus on that bit, going back to your meaning and purpose, being very clear about why we're doing stuff.
Yes, and not to try to second guess what might be coming. There's an awful lot of time, which I would put in the category of noise, where people are going, well, what might Boris Johnson announce next? Well, I wonder if we'll have to do this. Well, I wonder what will happen with that. Why not instead think, what is happening for us now? Let's be present with our own experience and wonder, what actually does make me feel really productive? And how can I show up in that way more often? So if I'm finding that, I'm zoomed out by 1 o'clock, why don't I say to my team, I am no good if I'm on Zoom calls all day. Just the same as when we were in the office, I was no good in being back in back-to-back meetings all day. I need to have breaks where I think about what we've just agreed or talked about, and I work out how to put that into practice. So I think the question for managers and leaders now is to enable teams to decide together how they want to work together now, and to facilitate that process on an ongoing basis, maybe review it weekly at first, or bi-weekly, or maybe monthly, and to say to managers, how does the team need you to show up? How does the team need you to be managing this so that they feel that they're really productive? And what's the conversation that you want to have quarterly that says, we're doing a good enough job? This is actually good performance. We're not measuring it as we did before because things have changed. So we're measuring it by our sense of, or by the conversations we're having, or by something we've produced, or whatever is relevant for the team.
Yeah, I agree. And I think actually you and I will be having a lot more of those conversations with companies and with managers in terms of helping them think about that process and how to facilitate that process, and just actually getting out, HR people, but getting out their performance management interview questions and binning them, and actually saying, you know what, here's a new set of questions, and these are much more meaningful questions. These are about how we work together, and they're focused on the relationships and so on. And I think you and I will be doing lots of sort of quite exciting developments in that area with companies who've got the foresight to say, actually, let's do things differently. So interesting things to come. Thank you very much, Frances.